Okay, welcome. Bienvenidos to the public lecture of the series Diversity Medialities, organized as cooperation between the Ibero-American Institute in Berlin and MESILA, the Maria Sibila Merian Center Conviviality and Inequality in Latin America. My name is Clara Rubituso. I'm postdoc researcher in MESILA and at the Ibero-American Institute. I will introduce our guest and moderate the discussion. Okay, our speaker today is Susanne Schultz. She's a MESILA Senior Fellow, currently guest professor for gender studies at the Karl Franzens University of Graz. Her research connects many topics and disciplines: biopolitics, theories of the state, transnational feminism, queer and gender theories, relation of reproductions, reproductive technologies, development and population policies, also critical migration studies, social science and technology studies, human genetics, and social movements. Susanne has an intense activity in different feminist networks and organizations. She is member of the network Reproductive Justice Berlin, member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Genetics Network, and the Respect Initiative Berlin for the rights of undocumented migrant domestic workers, among others. I will not mention all the publications, just one last year connected with the conference today. 2021, co-editor and author in the volume in German Mehr als Selbstbestimmung, Kämpfe für reproduktive Gerechtigkeit, More Than Self-Determination, The Fight for Reproductive Justice, published by the Kitchen Politics series in Münster. Thank you, Susanne, for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you also for sharing with me here these experiences of the MESILA research. So yeah, what I want to do this evening is to introduce you first a little bit in my research background and the MESILA research work in progress. In progress because of pandemic times, it was not really possible to share movements, histories on reproductive justice in Brazil, what I wanted to do with the MESILA research project. So it was quite more limited what I could do, but I will explain a little bit what I did and do some conceptual remarks. Okay, and then I will briefly introduce on the main topic of this research, the concept of reproductive justice as it has been introduced by the US, Black feminism, and show some important features as an analytical perspective, but also as a methodology and framework for alliance building. So this double content of this framework is important for all the speech and my research also. And the main topic of this evening will be to show some results of how justiça reprodutiva, as it has been translated to Portuguese, as a conceito potência, as a concept with potentialities, has been recently referred to by Black and popular feminism in Brazil. So I will do some brief historical introduction and also look at the analytical side of a shifting interpretation of reproductive relations, but also as a political methodology of how they interpret intersectionality and alliance building as convivial practice. And in the end, I will do some preliminary conclusions, open questions, and challenges. So now I want to go on, and it's not possible. I don't know what happens now. Okay. So first of all, the introduction into the research background. My academic and political background, you heard already a little bit about it, is already quite connected to what reproductive justice is about. I did a lot of research on issues around stratified reproduction, on the continuities and discontinuities of eugenics, on antinatalist neo-Malthusianism, population policies in the global south. And in this sense, I researched about the history of feminist struggles, also in the critique of the concept of population. So all these struggles are not only about bodies, they're always also about desired and not desired populations. And in this sense, I studied already the genealogies of an anti-racist, anti-ableist, and leftist feminisms in opposition to a hegemonic feminism. So all the story is now like coming on the stage really in an upswing of those feminisms who are currently doing like a counter-hegemonic project transnationally. And in this concept, or in this context, also the reproductive justice concept is a traveling concept that has really gained influence and visibility. And only to mention briefly, you already mentioned it, so it's very briefly. Also in the German context, we try to evaluate how this concept could be traveled to the German situation and context, and we published a book there, therefore, in my collective with a very important text by Loita Ross, one of the main US Black feminist founders of the concept, and debated how we can translate this concept to the German context within this network also of reproductive justice you mentioned already. So my research project for Messila called Feminist Convivialities, Alliances, Practices for Reproductive Justice started with a very simple research interest to ask how is the intersectional concept of reproductive justice adopted within counter-hegemonic Brazilian feminisms. And I'm thinking about I'm asking about, and have no final conclusions, but I'm asking about the analytical contents, which dimensions of reproductive relations, which specific relations of dominations have been incorporated within the Brazilian debates, but also the political how. How do alliance practices in the sense of convivialities shape the way how this is done as an important question for intersectional politics. Just to mention briefly why this concept of conviviality is close to this question. The Messila has this focus, the Messila program. I had the senior fellowship now, or have still, in the last week, I think, on the concept of conviviality and inequality, offers an analytical, non-static, process-oriented approach to the question of intersectionality. The idea is that in the convivial spaces of social movements, political speaking positions and individual or collective positionalities are not just pre-given, but are produced, reified, and transformed also. And this perspective might grasp the reproduction of hierarchies and the visibilities and inequalities in the movements, but also the transformation towards more horizontal solidarity principles. And under these conditions, the concept of alliance means not so much only formal, like cooperation between different organizations, but also a process within groups and organizations, within their way to relate to each other's being conscious about different positionalities within the groups also. So a methodological remark I have to do. An adequate research would involve forms of participatory process-oriented methodologies in order to approach movements' everyday activities. But this was not possible under pandemic conditions. So I shifted the research question to how do the movements themselves interpret intersectionality in their ways of convivial alliance practices. This is a more programmatic focus, as I asked them, how is their agenda on these practices? But the outcomes were nevertheless very, for me, very complex and interesting because they gave insights to a very complex, self-reflexive interpretation of intersectionality. And what I did concretely were online interviews and group discussions with representatives of Black feminist NGOs and networking groups of Feminismo Popular in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And moreover, then I analyzed documents, websites, and podcasts. So this about my research approach. So now I come to present what is it about this US Black feminist concept of reproductive justice as an iridescent approach, I would say, a very complex approach. The concept has been first articulated and introduced by a Black feminist initiative in the US in 1994. with the aim of questioning the hegemonic liberal pro-choice agenda within the US. Agenda focusing on individual rights above all to abortion, and this group of Black feminists, they questioned this very limited and very liberal, very universal perspective on reproductive issues. And they created the neologism of reproductive rights and social justice, the neologism of reproductive justice, combining reproductive rights and social justice. And this concept has then been a traveling concept, first within the US, adopted by Native, people of color, leftist, anti-racist feminist groups, and later also by disability and LGBTQI organizations and networks. And an important reference for reading about this complexity of this approach is certainly the work of Loita Ross as an activist and theorist who proposed an anti-essentialist concept, or who explained that reproductive justice is a framework for anti-essentialist alliances or intersectional alliances. There's one important text you might look at, because it shows how she introduces this framework in recent years also. And there will be in Kamp Nabel, I think, this weekend, Sunday, she will also speak in Hamburg in an event about reproductive justice. Reproductive justice is a call for radical change of the analytical and political perspective in the first side. The difference to reproductive rights or to the pro-choice agenda is going beyond the narrow focus of an individual self-determination in reproductive issues, but asking for the social embeddedness of every decision-making process and of the very different structural hierarchies and situations of domination, especially marginalized women are or oppressed within reproductive oppression. Specific groups are more affected than others, and there are totally different situations for doing individual decision making. And this concept, therefore, is beyond gender, addressing structurally unequal conditions of stratified reproduction. It's also beyond the focus on the right to choose not to have children, as typically white feminist, liberal feminism had focused, especially in the US, with the fight for abortion rights. So the first, only the first part of the demands of reproductive justice is focusing on this right. The second demand always is integrating the right to have children. And the third right, and this is very specifically interesting, I think, for changing debates on reproductive relations, is also the right to raise children under good social conditions and free of violence. So this very complex way to understand reproductive justice is addressing issues around the legitimation and precarization of certain mother and parenthoods, addressing the endless recyclable myths of the undeserving mother as a main perspective from which this reproductive justice is looked at. But reproductive justice is not only like a specific analytical political perspective of how to understand reproductive oppression, but also a certain methodology and framework for alliance building. As Loretta Ross always explains, it's not reserved to Black feminist organizing, but an anti-essentialist agenda against complex relations of reproductive oppression. However, she always also said, and a group of her presented within the US debate, reproductive justice has certain conditions. One is to maintain the visibility of the Black feminist genealogy of the concept. A second one is referring to a core programmatic agenda, addressing broad structural conditions of social inequalities. That's a main core issue for reproductive justice. And also giving voice to multiple lenses and experiences of reproductive oppression. So one important concept within the US text has been always the concept of storytelling, to give voice of very different experiences and hear them and hear them with the voices of those people who are most affected of reproductive oppression. Also, I would say it's a very important part of the framework to give close attention to the different valuation of future lives. So there is also the issue of necropolitical dimensions of racism, Malthusianism, and eugenics, always very present in the concept. So far I came now to introduce the concept in the US, and now I come to the way what I learned a little bit about how justiça reprodutiva in the Brazilian context as a concept of potência is debated, with references specifically from Black and popular feminisms in Brazil. And I want to do a preliminary remark. The way how the different interview partners and groups I looked at, I talked with, were a little bit different. On the one hand, there are Black and anti-extractivist feminist NGOs as protagonists for introducing the concept within Brazilian feminisms. So they are the ones who really put the concept into the debate, making public interventions, but also in their own networks, feminist networks, suggesting to use this concept. And the other way to refer to, I talked with multiplicadores of popular feminism of two organizations in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. And they were referring to issues of reproductive justice as part of a broader engagement within intersectional feminism. So it was not their main topic, reproductive justice, but it was very clear that the concept, how it is working, how it is shaped, is very easily connectable to what they are always debating in current times about intersectional feminism, decolonization, and other issues they are debating on. So first I want to do some remark about how did the concept arrive in Brazil and how the Black feminist promoters themselves explain this way of arriving. The concept in itself, justiça reprodutiva, is very recently debated, adopted in Brazil. They normally said like 2018 or something like that. But they always said that there have been similar approaches and debates in the early 1990s by Black feminist health movements, especially in the context of debate on mass sterilization, which has been a big topic in the 80s, beginning 90s. And there has been a big protest against this mass sterilization campaigns within Brazil. And they often refer to this history, for example, by referring to the declaration of Itapecerica, where Black women had met in 1993 to debate all these health issues from a Black feminist perspective. And the ways how they debated it were quite similar to the ways how the US Black feminists debated these issues at the same time. But one NGO interview partner said to me, because of the limitations of hegemonic feminist approaches, they withdrew from the explicit reproductive rights issues. So on the next time, there was not a lot of Black feminist reproductive health or rights engagement, at least not in a visible, explicit way. And she explains that historicamente nós sempre estivemos fazendo debate sobre direitos sexuais e reprodutivos, só que muitas vezes não empregando essa insígnia. E aí, a partir de 2018, quando a gente fala, não, peraí, vamos reposicionar, vamos dar uma virada nisso aqui. I'll say it in English again. Historically, we have always been having debates on sexual and reproductive rights, but often not using these terms, not using this insignia. But then now in the recent years, from 2018, we started to say, no, wait a minute, let's reposition, let's turn this around. Let's enter into the debate on reproductive rights in the way of reproductive justice. So importantly for the analysis for Black and popular feminist shifting frameworks is certainly the way to adopt the critique of partial individualizing pro-choice politics by saying justiça reprodutiva está no centro da discussão sobre justiça social e não está restrita a aspecto singular da vida reprodutiva. So reproductive justice is seen as a holistic approach to all all parts of social justice, and it's not a singular issue topic. And the other thing, also in the debate with the groups, feminist group conversations of popular feminism, it was very clear in the debate that there is a difference between escolha or choice and real communes abertas, real pathways, real possibilities. For example, one woman said she wished to get sterilized as a result of the jornada quadrupla, as a result of the heavy workload in times of pandemics. But this is not a wish under conditions of free decision making. So she said, under these conditions, I would like to get sterilized, but not as a free choice, but as a free way. It's as a choice, but a very formal choice, but not as a very free condition of changing my life. So there are three set of issues very typically debated under the concept of reproductive justice. First are like classical reproductive health demands with a focus on social inequality and institutional racism. So the debate is is focusing on social unequal access to a lot of issues. For example, to legal abortion, which has been exacerbated under Bolsonaro government. For example, when legal abortion, which is only possible in issues of health situation or rape, has been restricted. For example, in the situation of rape, this is the Portaria, this Ministry of Health decision to restrict legal abortion more bureaucratically, and saying that you need a police report if you want to get an abortion. And this has not been the case before because it was debureaucratized by the movements before, but now it's again in a more difficult situation. And the reproductive justice framework is to say there's a very unequal access by different groups of women, and we have to see the structural and institutional conditions of racism and inequality to understand who gets access to abortion and who not, and also who is exposed to obstetric violence and differences in maternal mortality. And there's a demand for deeper analysis, as I said, of structural and institutional conditions of this situation. As one Black feminist NGO representative said, what is sure, the hegemonic feminist groups had always recognized that Black, Indigenous, and LGBT women are more affected, or LGBT people are more affected. However, there's an analytical void of structure to understand the structural background. So they analyzed it as if violencia obstétrica está pairando aquí y ela cae sobre as cabeças. That would be saying they analyzed the differences, but they analyzed as if this difference is falling on our heads from the sky without analyzing this difference. So the second emerging attention, the second issue, reproductive justice or justiça reprodutiva, is debated in Brazil, is a re-emerging attention to antinatalist agendas. For example, there has been a feminist protest against the Portaria number 13, 2021 by the Ministry of Health, when the Ministry of Health suggested to use hormonal implants in the public health system only for certain groups, for women living on the street, for those with HIV/AIDS, or women in prison, or also for sex workers. So it was very clear which groups were addressed to get this long-term hormonal implants, 3 or 5 years of effectiveness to make the women to control their birth, make birth control. And the protest against this was to say there's a return to a birth control for a specific popular group, for Black women, Indigenous, and poor women, and this is presenting itself like a promotion of eugenic practices, racist and colonial practices, which are persisting in the actuality with the protagonism of the state and also with the pharmaceutical industry. So there is a certain retaking this debate on sterilization, also looking back to successes of the movements. because there are certain legal restrictions to do it, but still there are a lot of examples. So that popular feminist networks mention various examples of involuntary sterilization in the recent years and are putting it to the public and debating it. The third issue I would like to focus especially on within the debate on reproductive justice or justicia reproductiva is also, as also in the US context has been suggested, a new way of connecting reproductive health issues with politicizing, delegitimized and attacked mothering and parenting. So another issue for all this fight is o direito a ser mãe dos filhos que nós já temos, as the podcast of Criolla explains. The right to be mother of the children we already have. And this means that there are a lot of different issues taken into the framework of justicia reproductiva. As, for example, in the group discussions, they mentioned protests by mothers against police violence and murder. As, for example, famously also Monica Cunha from the Movimento Moleque is explaining as a human rights defenders and justicia reproductiva groups are referring to her also as one of the lot of mother groups from favelas and from peripheral spaces who are fighting against police violence and other issues. She said in an interview that nowadays it's not just about giving birth and raising a child. You have to fight so that they remain alive, because she herself lost a son to police violence and engaged in this fight against police violence. And there are other issues put on the plate now and to the public, like threat of child abduction in cases of homeless women or women in prison. And when I debated in these groups with the multiplicadoras of the popular feminist groups, they immediately refer to a lot of cases and examples where they are also doing solidarity work and support work and immediately said this is part of reproductive justice issues. And what I think what is very important if we see this change in the analytical perspective is that there is a fundamental rethinking of feminist perspectives on reproduction and mothering. In the first place, as I already mentioned, and we can debate this later more, they always look at the relations of reproduction addressing reproductive bodies and populations, because it's always about which populations are desired and which are not desired as a group along racist and class hierarchies or ableist hierarchies also. And it's not only about individual reproductive bodies. We can grasp this problem of reproductive injustice. And the second issue, what I think is really important to think more about it, and sometimes also not it's implicit and not always explicit, but in the end it's very clear. There's a reframing of feminist political references to motherhood itself. Beyond the old ways to see mother movements or movements for rights to mothering have been often seen in the development debate on gender issues, like issues of practical gender needs, or have been seen as an analysis of motherhood as a conservative speaking position. So often when mothers organized from a gender political perspective, this has been seen not so radical, more practical, more survival-oriented, but not as a really transformative perspective. And I think what is happening now with the reproductive justice perspective, and not only in this concept, in this word, what's happening in general in the debates now of counter-hegemonic feminism, that instead there's a racialized, discriminated and delegitimized mother and parenthood is interpreted as a positionality of radical resistance from the margins. And we can see this, for example, easily when we see how for example, Marielle Franco, as the murdered city councilor in Rio de Janeiro, is remembered. She's always remembered as a black, favelada, lesbian, single mother. So her motherhood is also part of remembering her. So now I come to the second way of looking at justicia reproductiva. The first until now was how in Brazil the movements referred which analytical framework they have and how they refer to the demands and what do they integrate on it. And now I would like to say something about the organizational claims of intersectionality and alliance building as convivial practice. What was interesting for me is that there has been a complex interpretation within the popular feminist group discussion how they understand alliance building and intersectionality as part of their convivial practice. And on the one hand, they interpreted intersectionality from the recognition of clearly attributed positionalities. That's a very classical way to do it. And it's also important to do it. They recognized hierarchical differences also within the groups of different positionalities. For example, in a group with lesbian and heterosexual women, or in a group with trans women and cis women, or in a group with domestic workers and workers with possibility to have a own private home. So they have a lot of difference within the groups. And they say that's important to recognize this and also debate on it. And it's also necessary to do activities of solidarity, specifically for Black feminist, trans feminist, and indigenous feminist struggles, that I think are the struggles all movements are currently especially looking at and learning from. And there's always also highlighting the importance of separate forms and spaces for organizing. So how far it's more like debating different experiences as a given situation, which have to be recognized, to recognize. But what I wanted to focus more, on the other hand, there's also a lot of reflection how intersectionality is a result of convivial collective learning processes. And this has been very clear when women in the groups and in the conversations we had said they understand power relations as relations that nos atravesan, look at my translations, relations that pass through us, or that na verdade passam pela vida de todas, that in fact, in reality, they pass through everyone's life. So there was a lot of talk about avoiding discussions in boxes, this is a caixinha, to not put fixed categorizations to certain groups of women within the collective, and to do intersectional politics sem que a gente esteja fechada nesse lugar, without us being locked in one place. Referring to the lesbian women within the group, they said, yeah, we have to recognize that we have to see more that we are not all heterosexual women, there are a lot of lesbian women, but we don't have to make them to put them into a fixed box or put ourselves as lesbian women into a fixed box within the group. So, but reflect collectively what this means, for example. They said we have to rethink collectively decolonizando our own attitudes, analysis, and collective self-positioning. So, for example, one group has reflected that they are not only a workers' feminist group, but they are also a Black feminist groups, because most workers in the groups are also Black women, racialized women. Or there's a reference to trans feminism as learning process about toxic familiar violence against trans people, but even more as a general reference for a radical critique of heteronormativity. So it's not just about understanding the specific situation of trans people, but it's also a lot about learning and radicalizing the critique on heteronormativity for all the group. The conceptual references which help to think about this way of thinking intersectionality of these organic intellectuals and have, for example, been the concepts of aquilambamento urbano, now lugar, or bem viver. I will address a little bit to these three ways to see it, and then I come to the conclusions. So the concept of aquilambamento, as Juliana Streber, for example, also has explained in a Messila working paper very nicely, is a concept that comes from the reference to the communities fugitive slaves had enslaved people who resisted against slavery and had built their own resistant communities is a reference not only to the past, but somehow to an absent present way of thinking community and resistance. And as Juliana Streber has explained, it's an expression of distance from a segmentary understanding of identity without making positionalities invisible. She also explained that positionalities are interpreted as not only the personal experience of an individual body, but also the public aspects of experiencing the world from one locus. And it's also, as she said, this way of resisting directly or referring to the Quilombo is also a way of articulating practical survival with strategies of social transformation. Another concept was what was articulated within the group discussions was the concept of no lugar, of non-place, I would say. The idea, the experience of being caught between the stools, not only as Black women, that's what is the very way of how Black feminists have explained the concept of non-lugar, of being excluded by Black movements as being a woman and by feminist movements as being Black, but also in other experiences, for example, as favelada and academic at the same time. As some of the multiplicadoras explained that they're looked at as favelada, at the same time they're learning, they're doing academic work, but are somehow also between the stools. And this references to Black feminist thought is important also in the debate in the movements. For example, I have a quote by Jamila Ribeiro as one of the important Black feminist theorists in these times, who is doing also books to transfer knowledge about Black feminist history and thinkers from Brazil and also from the US. And she explains this non-lugar, the lugar de outsider, pois este espaço proporciona às mulheres negras ponto de vista especial por conseguirem enxergar a sociedade através de espectro mais amplo. Auch nochmal, I did translate a moment. It's an outsider place because the place provides, the place from non-lugar, no-lugar is a place, outsider's place, and this place provides Black women with a special point of view, and they are able to see society through a broader spectrum. So they also argue, we know this from the debate of identity politics, to say those who are putting themselves in a very universal position of knowledge are the ones who have a very specific positionalities, while we, in these experiences of being between the stools and from knowing entangled ways of oppression, we have even a more broader perspective on social relations. And there's another concept I wanted to explain that's referring to a very collective way to understand intersectionality also. It's the concept of bem viver. It's referred to in diverse ways when talking about justicia reproductiva. For example, with reference to a holistic health approach and all the history of fights for a unified system of health services. As in Brazil, there has been this long history of a holistic approach of health, public health. But they also do refer to bem viver as from a perspective of a post-extractivist economy, or with the perspective of transformation toward it, and to agendas of communal life and commoning. So one interview partner said, we need concepts such as bem viver que possibilitam que a gente organize os fatores do fato social para compreender como também nós nos organizamos, ou em resposta, ou em propositura de algo diverso. That means, so the concept of bem viver makes it possible for us to organize the factors of fé social. She refers there to Durkheim and fé social. It's like the rules beyond the individual, the social rules, the social network beyond the individual, in order to understand how we also organize ourselves either in response to or in proposition of something different. There's another reference to collectively thinking ways of understanding intersectionality. So these were like the two sides of preliminary impressions I had from the debate on Justicia Reproductiva in popular and Black feminism. And I want to do now some preliminary conclusions, open questions and challenges. Justicia Reproductiva is a very recent concept adopted by counter-hegemonic feminist movements in Brazil. And it suggests a very profound way of challenging and rethinking feminist politics with respect to reproductive relations. I want to quote again in Brazilian Portuguese, but I will also translate what Fernanda Lopes, as one of the intellectuals who is a Black public health expert who is always introducing this concept in a lot of debates. And she says, nós estamos num campo que é muito novo, que está em construção, que é campo de disputa e também campo muito fértil. É conceito potência, uma estratégia interseccional e decolonial, uma prática discursiva, mas, sobretudo, uma convocação para uma mudança sistêmica em busca de justiça social, equidade para todas as pessoas. So in English, we are in a field that is very new, that is under construction, that is a field of dispute and also a very fertile field. It is a potential or a concept of potentiality, an intersectional and decolonial strategy, a discourse of practice, but above all, a call for systemic change in search of social justice and equity for all people. So now I come to some of these challenges. I would say analytical and political challenges for researching feminist reproductive justice policies, not only in Brazil. I would say there's an implicit or explicit fundamental reformulation of central feminist and gender theoretical narratives and concepts. One I already mentioned is rethinking reproductive relations as both body and population policies, and as a challenge for conceptualizing intersectionality and necropolitics of population. So what I mean is that this debate goes beyond the individual body and the reproductive health of the body, but is integrating really the question which lives, which social groups are supported and are desired within the society, and which one are not desired and are not seen to be reproduced, also in the way of not questioning also their future existence. A second challenge, I would say, is that the concept is decentering the theoretical feminist narratives on the genealogy of mothering and the family, because the view on the main focus is on motherhood, which has been always delegitimized or hindered or attacked. So it's about the experiences of those women who are not seen as the ideal housewife and the ideal mother promoted by society or by politics, but the other way around. The history of all those women who are, and persons also, not only women, always persons with uterus is always a term how they talk also, who is excluded from the idea of parenting and who is not seen as valuable for it. So it's also about very theoretical principal issues they bring into the debate. And this has to do, and I think it's also a challenge. They reclaim a radical different approach to mothering, parenting, within a highly contested terrain in times of anti-gender forces, which focus on the heteronormative family model and the caring mother as main reference. So I think there's a polarization of debate how to approach politically mothering and parenting, and there will be still a lot of questions and debate, I think, how movements will do this. So that's the last sheet. And this is done in the context of intersectional feminism as an effect of convivial alliance and learning practices. So as we have seen, reproductive justice within the current Brazilian counter-hegemonic feminist culture is embedded within a very sophisticated and complex understanding of intersectional policies. We have seen there's a strong reference to a specific Black feminist genealogy of understanding intersectionality. With Encarnacion here as a public can explain even better all the history of the Combahee River Collective and a lot of ways to see the collective struggle to oppose interrelated and entangled relations of oppression as a reference. Also, really theoretically, these women are studying and doing now. There's at least a double agenda of strong on the one hand and fluid speaking positions on the other hand, giving voice, supporting marginalized speaking positions on the one hand, but on the other hand, a permanent process of collective self-repositioning and self-reflection. And this lays the ground for policies of alliances as convivial practice of collective learning processes without negating or excluding conflict. So just as a last comment, this is the way how they themselves are reflecting the ways doing politics in general and very connected to the Justicia Reproductiva framework. But in the end, my scope of investigation was very limited. These are very recent developments, and it's an open process where it will go on. And I'm very curious to learn a lot more from these movements.